whole world has been watching us. Like all of these children and all of these people who are being killed and massacred. We don't matter. The whole world has failed our nation.
Well, just yesterday, new atrocities were unleashed in Syria by the Assad regime. Multiple airstrikes, including a toxic gas attack on Idlib, a rebel-held province in northern Syria. It killed as many as 100 civilians, including children. Tonight, you're going to hear from two enormously brave doctors who are with me. They still work in the region. They refuse to abandon the people of Syria. And they're going to tell us what it's like to work in the heart of hell. On my right is Dr. Rola Halan. She's a London-based Syrian anesthesiologist who spent her early childhood in Damascus. She's just back from the Syrian border, where she's helping with efforts to build a children's hospital. And she's made over 6 missions to the country. And over here is Dr. Annie Sparrow, an Australian-born pediatrician, public health expert. She's based in New York. Annie travels to the Syria-Turkish border every 3 months to train new Syrian medics, the selfless men and women on the ground who are trying to replenish the decimated ranks of medical personnel. Before we start to talk, I did want to show a video from yesterday that came via the White Helmets, the heroic emergency response team. And I want to warn you, it is very graphic, and we struggled with the decision to show it, but it really does tell you what the words chemical attack mean. Annie, this is beyond horrifying. Tell me about yesterday's attack and what you know about it.
Imagine 6 o'clock in the morning, everyone's asleep in their bed, and most of them are already sleeping in basements because the relentless targeting of civilians means that basements have now been turned into bedrooms and whole homes. When the first missile was dropped, a lot of children and their families went immediately to the nearest shelter, which often happens to be a cave underground, because they'll be safer there. Here's the thing about poison gases like sarin and chlorine, which were used, or some experimental cocktail. Both of them are heavier than air, so they sink down into basements. They sink down into underground hospitals. Both of those places offer protection from the relentless barrel bombs, but they are the worst places to be when you have a poison gas. Sarin suffocates you to death. And a lot of children were already dead on arrival by the time they reached the hospital. Many just died on the spot in their beds, and hundreds more were affected.
And where would the people that we see in that video have been taken for treatment?
They were being taken to Akrama Hospital, which is on the outskirts of Khan Sheikhoun, which is a completely civilian town. It's a civilian town, there's no military base, there's nothing there except families, women and children mostly. So they were being taken by the White Helmets to a hospital on the outskirts called Akrama Mercy Hospital, which is in a cave underground. So after a couple of hours, when the regime knew that that would be full of patients, of survivors, that hospital was then deliberately targeted. The Syrian government isn't very good about targeting, but here's a great example of how the Russians would have given them the GPS coordinates, so they knew exactly where to bomb and to do so with maximum intent to destroy as many survivors of this attack and to kill as many doctors, to punish them for trying to kill the people, for trying to heal the people that the Syrian government wants to kill.
And that's the inconceivable cruelty, that not only were they experiencing the gas attack, but then go to the hospital and they're bombed there. It's unbelievable.
So a lot of people were afraid to go to the hospital, of course, and they didn't. Sarin doesn't wear off. So even as it got worse, more died during the course of the day, but a lot of people were too frightened to go to the hospital because they didn't want to be killed.
Because they knew they would die there. Rolly, you've worked in cities all over Syria, Homs, Damascus, Idlib, Aleppo. Tell me what your experience has been as a doctor on the ground, and how are the doctors coping with these kind of conditions?
It's one thing when you are seeing people taking their last breath right in front of you, but it's quite another when you are trying to deal with it with the most minimal of resources, when you don't have things as basic as oxygen or the right size drip to put into a child. And then to add another level of complexity to it, you're also in the same war zone with the civilians. And I remember being in one of the hospitals and hearing a bomb go off, and I just remember thinking, oh my God, this might be the day that I'm going to die. It's just an incredible added pressure and added level of difficulty when you're dealing with, in that resource-low setting with this mass casualties, and you think that your own life might be in danger as well. But that's when their incredible heroic work happens, because they act so selflessly and they actually go to the heart of the problems where the bombings are occurring in order to save lives.
That's unbelievable. Annie, I don't think that people are really fully aware of the fact that Assad is deliberately targeting hospitals. I mean, you have called it the weaponization of healthcare. When did that evil take hold, and how did that happen?
That's been used as a strategy of this war since the very beginning in March 2011, when what we call the Arab Spring and the Syrian revolution was just beginning. It didn't become a war until about mid-July the following year. And right from the beginning, doctors were punished for trying to heal civilians injured at protests. Imagine the Women's Day rally in Washington and being shot at, and then not being able to go to any hospitals in Washington, or the same thing happened here. You couldn't go to Bellevue, you couldn't go to Cornell, you couldn't go to Mount Sinai, my hospital. You couldn't go to any of those hospitals unless you were a Trump supporter. That's what it would look like. So what he's doing since the beginning in targeting, executing doctors, arresting them for treating patients, and making treating patients an actual crime and targeting the hospitals, he's using people's need for health as a weapon against them. There's more than 5 million refugees. No one's going to stay where there's no doctor. So now we're faced with well over 800 medical personnel, means doctors, nurses, paramedics, and so forth, have been killed, and acts of war crimes, because these are all war crimes. And 90% of those have been done by the Assad government, backed by Putin and backed by the Iranians.
Rolla, you've been on many medical missions in Syria, and you told me about one in 2013 in Aleppo that you found particularly definitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the worst and hardest day of my life. We had just come out of the basement of the hospital because a warplane was flying above, so we were all advised, as we always do, to go to the lowest part of the hospitals in case they target it. So we'd just come out, and one by one, we were seeing these ghoulish-looking children walking in. You know that really infamous Vietnam photo of the girl coming from the napalm bomb coming like this? They were all literally coming in one by one, clothes are hanging off them, covered in white powder dust, with the most heart-wrenching smell of burnt, singed flesh coming in. And I remember just looking, and I felt like I'd been moved or transported to a Hollywood horror show or a horror scene. It was at the time when the last big chemical weapons attack had happened in Damascus. It was 5 days afterwards, so we didn't know what was happening. We thought, is this a chemical weapons attack? So we started to treat them as if they were, until we got the intelligence that it was a big incendiary weapon, which is basically a big ball of fire that was dropped from the airplane onto a schoolyard where 10 to 16-year-olds were waiting after school to be picked up by their children, by their parents. There's one boy who sticks in my mind, and he's etched into my mind. He walks in, and he is so burnt, he looks like a tree bark. I'd never, ever seen anything like it before. And he'd lost all his hair, everything. He literally walked in solid, like so solid, he couldn't bend his arms. And I was so stunned. The only thing I could think to say was, "How are you?" I didn't know what else to say. I'd never seen anything like that before. And he went, "I'm okay," because he was all completely burnt on the inside. And I remember knowing, you know, my mass casualty training, we know that these patients, they're going to die. Like, there's no hope in trying to treat them. But I knew that the way he would die would be to suffocate. And that's why yesterday I was completely paralyzed, because seeing those images and those kids suffocating to death was what I saw in so many of those children on that day. And I knew he was going to suffocate to death, so I did treat him so that he would slip away rather than kind of suffocate. And yeah, 10 of them, 10 died in our hospital and on the way to Turkey, and another 10 just arrived charred and completely burned.
Annie, Assad has become more and more flagrant about torture, and even military hospitals have been turned into torture places. What have you seen of this? I mean, have you had any encounter with that?
Turning a hospital into a place of torture is possibly the worst violation of medical ethics you can think of. And this means a lot of hospitals are now used as torture chambers. They're also used to give medical aid to Syrian army combatants. But if you're a wounded soldier or a civilian who's wounded in any way, then you are not allowed to go for fear of being taken in and tortured, and that happens a great deal. That means people who get arrested at rallies, if you're injured, if you're shot, and you end up with or beaten, so you have an open fracture or a gunshot wound, you'll be taken and often left not to heal. Okay, so your wounds fester, they can then become infected, you develop gangrene, and you are left with bones sticking out of your legs. And this means that, you know, not only are doctors targeted in the opposition areas, but in the military hospitals. One of my great friends, Dr. Abdi, was working in one, and this was early 2013 in Aleppo. And there was no conflict at that stage. So he was watching a whole, you know, scores of civilians come in who had been shot and beaten and, you know, come into the hospital, and he wasn't allowed to treat them. And then they would get tortured, which means everything from, you know, pulling your fingernails out, cigarette burns, having your skin literally ripped off, electrocuted. I mean, they would use your wounds and, you know, make them a lot worse. But then there's a visit by the UN and Joint Arab League Special Envoy, and they want to talk to everyone. So my friend was called to the Major General, and he had 3 generals say to him, "We know who your family are, and we know you will do the right thing, because the UN is coming and they want to see every patient in the hospital, but they may not see these patients. You have to silence them." He said the subtext of that was possibly the most terrifying thing, because they were saying to him, "You do this, or we're going to arrest and torture your family and your wife's family, and we will do that." So he was forced to. As a doctor, he then had to anaesthetize every single patient. 60-odd patients were literally then covered up, put to sleep, and then covered up over all the electrocution, all the wounds, all the torture marks, all the shackles, asleep, so they could not talk, and they looked like they were just patients who were rehabilitating. So, and after that, he defected with all of his family. So, and we know right from, you know, not just half a mile away, it's not just these, you know, military hospitals, there's a lot of black sites. So, not half a mile away from the Four Seasons in Damascus, which is where the UN live on a permanent basis. So, your units there for WHO, World Health Organization, you live there at the Four Seasons. Half a mile away, there's a black site under the National Library. It's like having a black site under the New York Public Library. And he's getting away with it.
Incredible.
That's not the only one.
Rolla, you have family, right? I mean, you're from Homs originally. What's happened to your family that have been in Syria? Because you now live in London. What has happened to them?
Mm-hmm. Sadly, we lost over 30 members of my family. They were killed mostly in 2012 and 2013 during the big assault on Bab Amr and in Homs. One family, all 18 of them were slaughtered, had their throats cut, from an 18-month-old to the grandmother, all in one day. So some are internally displaced, some are refugees. just one of the very many, one of the few of the big numbers that you guys read about.
Well, obviously, I mean, this is such horror that you're describing. It is so extraordinarily upsetting. I mean, what happens now? I mean, and what happens to the people of Syria who are simply regular civilians who are just going about their lives trying to get medical help too? I mean, not only people who've been bombed, but people who just have sickness, you know, who are having a baby or who are, you know, requiring medical help. Who treats them and what happens to them?
Well, I mean, we have very, very few medical facilities left and even fewer doctors. But I have to say, I want everyone to know this is not actually just a story of doom and gloom, in the sense that what keeps me going is the Syrian doctors, nurses, and aid workers. These are some of the most phenomenal people I've ever been honored to meet and to know. They get up, massacre after massacre, dust themselves off, and go and do their life-saving work. So they are there. They are nowhere near the numbers that we need. There's 11 million people who are in need of dire medical help. And what that looks like is that women are delivering on their kitchen floor. Children, when they have a simple chest infection, do not have antibiotics. I got told so many reports of people who are having surgery without anesthetics. I mean, as an anesthesiologist, that just makes my hair stand on end. But these medics and doctors are there, and I really would love to tell everyone more about them, because they are the light, the ray of hope.
Well, Annie, what has been your experience in terms of what you can do to actually help, and what should we be thinking about doing? What can we possibly do for these doctors?
No one wants to watch the scenes that you've seen, and they don't want to watch it either, and they don't want to deal with it anymore, and they do need our support, and they also need us to, you know, they also will say to me, Annie, there's still more life than death in Syria, and there is, because people didn't come out in the streets in 2011 to discover all these different ways to die. You know, chemical weapons, the bombs, the snipers, being shot to death, being tortured to death, being starved to death. There's, you know, over 1 million people being besieged by the Assad government with the help of Hezbollah and the Russians. They came out to live. You know, they came out to find out what freedom meant. They came out to discover dignity. Actually, they didn't even know what these things meant, because you don't know what they mean when you live under a dictator. So Syrian doctors need a lot of things. They need our support. They need us to know what's going on. And they need us to give a fuck. They really need us to give a fuck. Tina asked me today for a hashtag. And I gave it to a force for good, because I think we can still be a force for good. But for that to happen, we all do need to give a fuck. And if you give a fuck about one single thing, give a fuck about these kids who are dying and the doctors who can't even treat them because they're either being killed as they try, like my friend Dr. Ali Dawish, who was killed only a week ago, 10 days ago, in a similar chemical attack just a few miles away from Khan Shaykhun. And he was operating on a patient, and he couldn't leave the patient until the patient was through the critical surgery. The patient was on a ventilator. He inhaled the sarin and chlorine, and he was the one who died. So we need to give a fuck about this one thing.
Rolla, you spend your time trying to help build hospitals, right? I mean, tell us now about the organization that you have, that you're working with. It's incredible to me, frankly, that there is one pediatric hospital that's been bombed, 6 times, 7 times? It keeps getting rebuilt. It's staggering to me that it gets rebuilt, that, you know, doctors are willing to go back and work there. So tell us what you're doing to make that happen.
Sure. So, I've been involved in setting up 6 hospitals, and the first question that we always ask ourselves is, where is this hospital not going to get bombed? Where can we set it up to make it as safe as possible for our patients, for our doctors and nurses to actually work within this hospital? So last November, with the besiegement of eastern Aleppo. One weekend, there were 5 hospitals that were bombed, including a children's hospital. This is the hospital you're talking about that had been bombed 6 times before. When that happened, I honestly I felt like I'd lost a family member, because I'd just been so involved in the humanitarian work and in setting hospitals, and you shed blood and sweat to do that. And I just remember thinking, what the fuck is this? We can't be, this is not acceptable. So we need to do something. So I contacted the Independent Doctors Association, which is one of CANDO's partners. I said, what do you need? We need a new children's hospital. Right. I knew that there were just so many people around the world who wanted to actually show support and solidarity. So we launched the People's Convoy campaign, and we, incredibly, with the support of about 5,000 people, raised £250,000 in just 10 days to set up a children's hospital, which actually opened its doors today.
Hey.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Today, really, my heart felt like it was smiling. Yesterday, I was paralyzed with sadness. Today, my heart was smiling. There's 50,000 children in northern Aleppo that are going to be benefiting from this hospital. And this is going back to your question, Tina, is that these doctors and nurses are standing up day and day again. The resilience, can you imagine trying to set up a hospital for the 7th time? They haven't bowed over. They haven't said, no, we're not doing this anymore. They have said, as I said, that we are defiant against war criminals. We are defiant in the face of the inaction of our governments. We will not be stopped from doing our life-saving work. We will get up and we will keep going, and we will not be stopped from doing our life-saving work. They are really the ray of hope in Syria, and that's why I am hopeful for our future. And I really want to invite everyone to join our work and to support us.
Well, just to sort of conclude, for each of you, what would be your calls to action, Annie? I mean, there's a lot of people in this room who I know are going to be so deeply moved. Everyone is wanting to know what they can do to help the agony of Syria.
First of all, what you've seen tonight are war crimes. They are committed by war criminals. This means Assad and Putin. And what we can do, what you can do, what our US government and Congress must do is openly condemn them as war criminals and stop legitimizing them as presidents when they are dictators committing these war crimes. And as part of that, Trump must act and put a lot of pressure on the UN Secretary General to appoint the special prosecutor authorized by the UN General Assembly in December and get on with it and start gathering the evidence for the trial that will prosecute these war criminals. And then, secondly, the US government and every other donor government has to stop working with Assad and stop funding the UN agencies and the World Health Organization, which are actually providing billions of dollars of aid in the name of humanitarian relief, and yet it goes directly to Damascus. It's not going for not-for-profits. It's going to Assad-sanctioned, approved businesses disguised as NGOs that are all run by Assad's family and friends. So that's billions of dollars are then subsidizing Assad's killing machine. That has to be frozen until they stop targeting the hospitals, killing kids in their sleep, executing not only doctors but all manner of activists who are against this. Stop the sieging and just, fight ISIS. You can see this village was nowhere near ISIS. Go ahead and do that, but stop targeting civilians. And that's what I mean. Syrians haven't given up on the US, and I haven't given up either. I believe we can still be a force for good if we all give a fuck.
Rolla.
Thank you.
Last word. Thank you, Annie. Rolla. last word to you. We have run out of time, so...
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first one is go local. 75% of the humanitarian work in Syria is being done by Syrian NGOs, but we get less than 1% of the funding. So if you want to really save lives of Syrian civilians, please support the work of Syrian organizations. If you don't know who they are, come and find me. I do. The second one is I really want everyone to show and demonstrate their solidarity and support with Syrian medics. We feel so abandoned by the world. We feel so completely forgotten. And if, as Annie says, you do give a fuck, then I invite you to stand up right now in solidarity and in support with my colleagues who are doing such incredible work. I'd like you to use the hashtag that's about to appear behind me, which is the Force for Good. Send your messages of solidarity and support to Syrian humanitarians. Send them a selfie. Tell them that they are heard, tell them that they are seen, and tell them that you are standing with them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Annie,
Thank you.
Rolla, and Annie.
Thank you. Thank you.